Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. But we did get sort of the trickle-down follow-up from the story of this time last week, which was Dan Hurley meeting with the Lakers and ultimately turning down the Los Angeles Lakers and their coaching opportunity. We had not heard from Dan Hurley. As we know, he went out recruiting immediately after turning the Lakers down on Monday. The big NBPA Top 100 camp was Tuesday, Wednesday, so he was there. But on Thursday, he did a media tour where he was basically pretty much, if there was a camera, he was there talking, explaining his whole situation. He went on with Dan Le Batard. He went on with Colin Cowherd, did a long-form sit-down with Matt Norlander. And actually, right before we went live on air here, did do a press conference for the local media in Connecticut where he answered a lot of questions. He said a lot of things. And there certainly were some interesting things that were said. And let me tell you, you know how I know they were interesting? Because a ton of you sent them to me and said, Torres, you told us that there was no chance he was ever leaving, blah, 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 blah. Well, if you read this quote or that quote or whatever, you were clearly wrong. Well, let's get into some of the stuff that Dan Hurley said, the stuff that I did find interesting. But before we do, really quickly, let's go back to what I said about this whole situation from the beginning, okay? I actually, knowing that we were going to address this today, went back and listened to my Thursday show last week when the news first broke. Now, granted, it was about 12 hours after the news broke. I had been traveling. I was in Mexico. I came back, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But the genesis of what I said was this, is I said that I believed with about 85% certainty. I said, I don't really think this is much of a story. I don't think Dan Hurley is leaving. And it was for all the reasons we talked about. I don't really think he wants to coach LeBron James. I don't think he wants to draft Bronny. And then there were some other holes in the story that, in my opinion, didn't make sense about the Lakers' pursuit. And ultimately, what I said was this. I think that it was largely to get his deal done at UConn. It gives the Lakers an out to say that we did a real coaching search before we hired JJ Redick. But I did say on last Thursday's show, I said, listen, it's not, I don't think he's leaving for the Lakers, but it's not a 0% chance either that he's 100% coming back. And I went back and listened on Thursday's show. I put it at about 15%. I said about 15% chance he goes, 85% chance he stays. Obviously he does, but it leads to kind of the quote that was probably the most viral quote from the entire day. It came from the Dan Le Batard show. And listen, by the way, Dan Hurley certainly has, his perspective on everything that happened, but it did feel like he was trying to set the tone for the day and for, how he views what happened over the last couple of days. And so the first thing he did was kind of rip apart not only a narrative that I have kind of pushed, but I think there's a lot of people in the media that have kind of pushed this narrative that it was only about a contract extension. He was never taking the Lakers job. And it was interesting to see after he turned down the job, the next day he's on the road recruiting, it felt like pretty much everybody said that he basically used the Lakers to get his deal done at UConn. And so Dan Hurley to Dan Le Batard, this was kind of the quote that caught everyone's attention early. Direct quote from Dan Hurley. You can find the quote pretty much anywhere. He said, one of the worst takes I've heard is that this is a leverage play by me to improve my situation at UConn. I don't need leverage here. We've won back-to-back national championships at this place. This was never a leverage situation for me. So that was really the quote that probably got sent to me 20 or 30 times via DM, via tag, via Instagram, via Twitter, via text message, whatever. Torres, you said it was all about leverage, and he said that you're an idiot for even suggesting it. Well, first of all, I never suggested it was solely about leverage. As I said, it was about 15%. But whenever anybody sent that to me, you know what my first response was? Let me ask you a question. In any negotiation, pretty much anywhere, it could be sports, life, business, podcasting, whatever. Has anyone ever used another job offer as leverage and then ultimately admitted, yeah, that was solely for leverage? Like if your favorite baseball player, let's say he's a member of the whatever, the San Francisco Giants, and he's not happy with his contract, and he has a meeting with the Braves, and he has a meeting with the Dodgers, and then he decides to come back to San Francisco. You've never heard a baseball player or a football player or a basketball coach or baseball manager, whatever, say, yeah, you know what? I did use that for leverage. I was never taking that job. I was never taking that offer. No, everyone in every walk of life use stuff for leverage. I mean, I'll be honest, we're in the middle of, negotiating, advertisers and things like that for the fall. Like, you don't think it's better for me? Let's just say, this is a hypothetical. It's not true, but let's say Bud Light wants to be the official beer sponsor of this show. You don't think it's good for me to also have an offer from Coors Light on the table? Of course it is. So like this idea that because he said it wasn't a leverage play, that's 100% true, doesn't really make sense. But beyond that, here's the other thing that I find interesting. All of the people that sent me that article, I just have one question for you. Did you read literally the next quote from Dan Hurley immediately following that? Because if you read quite literally the next quote from Dan Hurley, he kind of admits that, yeah, it kind of was a leverage ploy. Here is the quote immediately following. He says, one of the worst takes I've ever heard is that it was a leverage play. Here's what he said immediately after that, though. He said, I've had a contract in place for a couple weeks, and the final part in terms of salary has been done for a while. There are some other parts like NIL and the staff salary and some different things that I want adjusted and I'm not comfortable with. But the sense of the idea that this was some conspiracy to get me a sweeter deal at UConn is just that. It's lazy. Okay, listen, I love Coach Hurley. Brought 2 national championships to my alma mater. But he just said it's not a leverage play, but he just admitted that it is a leverage play, that he isn't happy with where things are with NIL, with some of his staff salaries. And what was funny was, if you went back and listened to my Monday show, when he did officially turn down the job, this was something that we actually talked about on the show as well. I said my sources in stores basically told me that essentially, that they told me that that when everything was said and done, when the new deal was in place, what my sources in stores told me was that his salary wasn't going to look fundamentally different than what was projected. In other words, he wasn't going to go from 5.5 to 13 million or anything like that. But what I said on the show on Monday was exactly that. I said the salary is not going to be significantly different. Maybe a couple more zeros at the end, but it's not going to be anything crazy. He's not going to triple his salary or anything like that. But what it will do is set up his assistants, set up NIL. And the exact quote, and I know it that I said because producer Matt made it into a clip that we put on our Twitter and Instagram and TikTok, is what I said was Dan Hurley, ultimately what he wanted out of this whole situation, from my understanding, was basically what I said at the time, which is it wasn't about being the highest paid coach, although, he says he will be. That part I cannot confirm or deny. But what I said at the time was what he wants is essentially assurances that UConn will operate as the biggest and best program in college basketball. Again, we talked about this. Remember, we are entering in just a couple days, literally, a Big Ten and SEC world. Texas and Oklahoma go to the SEC on midnight, January 30th, and Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA do the same. So come July 1st, 90% of the power, 90% of the money, 90 is a hypothetical, but you get the point. The vast majority of the money and power is going to be in those 2 leagues. And so what Dan Hurley basically wants to say is, I don't want to wake up one day in a year or 2 and every SEC school, every Big Ten school, Oregon, Kentucky, Washington, Tennessee, whatever, they're just doing stuff that we can't do. And so I said from the beginning, this was a leverage. It was a leverage play, but it wasn't about being the highest paid coach. It was about making sure things in the program were done at the highest level possible, which is what I believe are going to be the case. let's get to some of the other quotes that I found interesting. Now, I will say this one I did find very interesting. Dan Hurley was asked by Dan Lebitard or one of his crew, whatever, if there was a number that would have convinced him to leave UConn for the Lakers. And he said, to leave, yeah, there was probably a number. To leave a place at any moment in your life, to say that it's not a motivating factor, the finances to leave a place is definitely a thing. And I found that interesting as well, because that was one thing that you kind of heard from the NBA side of things, from the NBA reporters. I think even the NBA reporters that cover the Lakers and that know that it's kind of a, let's call it what it is, what I've been calling it all week, a little bit of a poverty brand, that essentially even they were surprised. Like, you want Dan Hurley. You know that if he goes back to UConn, he's probably making 7.5, 8, 8.5, 9. And you only offer him $11 million a year. Now, 6 years, $70 million is great for 99% of society. But if you want to take a guy out of a great job, you know what you have to do? You have to blow him away with a number. And so I found that part interesting as well. One, I think it speaks to the Lakers. I think it speaks to some of the stuff that I said last week. I think they were interested in Dan Hurley. But I also think that, listen, if Dan Hurley was the guy that they wanted, I think they could have done a much better job of convincing him than they did. Is that because they really want JJ Redick? Is that because they wanted Redick all along? Is it because they wanted to show that they're doing a real search and that JJ Redick isn't the only candidate and hasn't been the only candidate since day one? Is it because maybe JJ Redick was getting cold feet and they needed to let him know that they had other options? Whatever the case, the number was not impressive. And I thought that was interesting from Dan Hurley, where he did say, look, there's a number that's going to make me think about it, but probably not the number that they offered. To me, that's interesting for a couple reasons. One, he did say throughout the day, can't promise that I'm going to be at UConn forever. He was asked that question at his press availability, and he just basically said, no, that's not something I could promise. You never know where you're going to be in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. It's just not something that you know. And so I found that part interesting as well. But what I was also thinking was this, like, if you are one of these owners with a crap ton of money, Mark Cuban's probably a bad example because, one, I don't think he even fully owns the team anymore. But two, on top of that, he also, is in the NBA Finals. So I don't think he's in search of a new head coach. But what I would say is, if you're let's use an example, Steve Ballmer. We all know he's got a ton of money, Los Angeles Clippers. He's in LA. And the question obviously becomes, what happens if it falls apart again next year? James Harden, Russell Westbrook, whatever. Well, Dan Hurley just admitted, yeah, there is a number that would have made me have to at least heavily think about it. But I didn't get that number from the Lakers. And if I was one of those other 29 owners, and I was one of those other 29 owners that had real money, that the money isn't tied into the organization like it is in the Lakers, that'd be something I'd file away. Because if I'm Steve Ballmer and money's no objective to me, I just hand Dan Hurley a blank check. If I'm Mark Cuban, if I'm whoever, fill in the blank, Mickey Arison, and Pat Riley in Miami, although I'm pretty sure Spo is going to have that job for a while. The point being that it does feel like there is a number that he has to at least consider. I found that part interesting as well. Couple other things, one, on Monday, we did talk about, or on last Thursday, we did talk about what I believe to be a little bit of a loyalty factor, is that, look, I don't think the timing of this situation was perfect either. Good jobs open in April. Good jobs open in May. And I believe if the Lakers had prioritized Dan Hurley on May 5th, the day after they hired Darvin Ham, they maybe make it a bit more likely. But remember, like we talked about, Alex Karaban is a star player, one of Dan Hurley's earlier recruits, entering his fourth year, been part of back-to-back national championships, and at the end of the NBA draft process, decided to come back to college. And I said, this might sound stupid, but I said, I think Alex Karaban is probably a reason that he considers staying, because Alex Karaban believed in him, and to leave Alex Karaban in mid-June without a lot of great options when he bet on you just doesn't feel like the thing that Dan Hurley would do. And so I bring it up because, credit Matt Norlander, this was one of the questions he asked. And this is what Dan Hurley said. He said, yeah, that was big. That was big. That was important. And again, I don't know, like, if he stays in the draft, I'm not sure what that does, because some players, the other returners, and then the transfers and the high school guys, the window would open up for them. He's insinuating that, yeah, they could still transfer, but their options would be very limited at this point. This was something we talked about as well, is I think everybody thinks, well, if all those players were available, oh my goodness, it would be a free-for-all. And to like some degree, it would have been. But to some degree, most rosters are set by this point. And so I think Dan Hurley, that was probably part of the decision as well, is like, if I leave right now, I'm going to screw over a lot of these kids, because some of them are going to have great options. Some of them aren't. And some of them are going to have to stay at UConn and don't know their future. So I found that quote interesting. But the last one I will say, listen, let me say this. Everyone's kind of got their own version of whatever. And I'm not here to accuse anyone of not telling the truth, whatever. The one thing I do disagree with on, though, is Matt Norlander did ask about the Billy Joel concert. And he, credit Matt. Listen, I know Matt a little bit. Ironically, I sat next to him at the Arkansas Duke game last year, talked to him obviously for a long time there. But he has some really good follow-up questions in terms of some of the semantics of the whole situation. He asked about not only showing up at the Billy Joel concert, but then also, remember, Luke Murray is an assistant coach who posted a clip from that concert. And Dan Hurley was asked about that. Basically, the insinuation being like, everybody's watching, everybody sees you're there, everybody sees that you're at Madison Square Garden, which they call Store South, which is a place that UConn plays quite often and frankly has dominated in of late. Like, you wouldn't really be at that concert posting videos if you were actually leaving. And Dan Hurley did say this, and this is the only part that I would have kept pressing him, because this part I find a little bit hard to believe. He said, no, I was completely undecided. We were just taking a mental break. We didn't even think about or talk about it over on the Uber to the Madison Square Garden. I think we were so stressed. I'm not complaining, because I love every second of it, but you go until the season ends. And then he goes on and on. I think my wife posted whatever, but he did say this part. He goes, and you get to a night where you've had a couple beers and you're at the concert, you've got great seats and you're just having fun and you're probably not thinking about the ramifications. That was the only quote that I saw that I was like, I don't know if I believe that. And it's not because I'm calling Dan Hurley a liar. And Dan Hurley's, he's not a liar as far as I'm concerned, but it's actually the opposite. I think he's way too smart. And I think he understands social media way too much to know the ramifications of that situation. Like, in other words, let me say this. Maybe he was somewhat on the fence, but I do think that he understands that it's not only his fans. Forget the fans, forget people sitting at home, whatever. His players are also sitting there on social media. 18, 21-year-old kids, even more so than me or you or whatever. They're on their phones all day, every day. So if they go and they see you at a concert having the time of your life, and then 24 hours later you tell them, I'm out, like, that is going to scar some kids that had a lot of trust in you. And so I've said from the beginning, Dan Hurley's left jobs for other jobs, whether it's high school to Wagner to Rhode Island to UConn. And there's probably a day where he's going to leave UConn for another job, probably in the NBA, almost certainly in the NBA. And, we could talk about where it would be if those jobs open up. But I just bring it up because that was the one part I didn't believe. It's like, I think if it was 75-25 that he was staying, then yeah, you go to the concert and have a good time. But if it's 25-75 and you're almost positive that you have to have the toughest conversation in your life, or one of the 4 toughest conversations in your life, I just don't buy that he would be at the concert having a good time, and certainly not letting Luke Murray post about it. And I'd add as well, from Luke Murray's perspective, like, he's a guy that's about my age. And let me tell you, I was on 2 or 3 group chats when that whole thing was going on. And I think he would get to, like, if we're on our way out, or if coach thinks he's on his way out, let's just, if somebody catches us in the crowd, that's one thing, but let's not post a picture of us having the time of our lives. Let's just enjoy the concert. I'm not putting anything on social media, whatever. That was just about the only part that I kind of was just like, Coach, I love you. Not totally sure that I believe that, though. but whatever. There was some other interesting stuff, but those to me were the big ones. Like everyone said, oh, Torres, he said that it wasn't a leverage play. It's like, well, I mean, no one has ever claimed it was a leverage play after the fact, but we kind of know what it was. And so I'm certainly happy that Dan Hurley is back at UConn. I'm certainly happy that he's back in college basketball. But I still largely stand by what I've said from the beginning, is I think, listen, we talked about it on Thursday's show. When the Lakers call, you got to at least take it. As my buddy who listens to this show said, it's like Entourage, right? We've all watched Entourage. Ari Gold, Vince, take the meeting. I don't care if you don't think you're going to do the job or not. You don't want to play Aquaman. Who cares? Take the meeting. You don't know what they're going to say. So I think he was going to take the meeting, but I said 10 to 15% on Thursday's show. It ended up being the case. Happy he's back. Great for college basketball. Certainly great for UConn. But let me also be fair as well and say that just because he's back this year, now kind of the cat's out of the bag. Now NBA teams know that if you come at him right, there is an interest there. So do I think he's going to take the Portland Trailblazers or the Orlando Magic? Probably not. But I think if the right opportunity comes, I think there will be a day where probably, as I said on last Thursday's show, Torres is going to have a tough conversation, get on that mic and really, not have a very fun conversation, because I do suspect there will be a day where Dan Hurley leaves, but thankfully it isn't today.